You are not allowed to speak. You kneel, naked from the waist down, trembling under the carved archway of an unfamiliar building. The marble beneath your knees is cold, stained in places with dark residue that never washed out. Your eyes sting from the incense smoke. Your ears ring from the endless chanting. And behind you, the man holding the silver blade does not ask if you are ready. He simply waits for the signal. You were born to a different language, a different god, a different name. You still remember your mother screaming as the soldiers dragged you away. That scream lasted longer than your entire journey south, through mountain passes and desert heat, chained to a line of boys who looked just like you, terrified, thin, forgotten. And now, you kneel for your final moment as a boy. The court physician wears gloves soaked in vinegar. He looks at you, not as a person, but as material. You were purchased by weight, examined by teeth and hips, and now you are shaped by blade and bandage. A vessel, he says, must be clean. Clean of lust, clean of rebellion, clean of manhood. The blade slices through the chanting. You try not to scream, but your body betrays you. The blood does not stop. The world spins. You wake up later in a room with 4 other boys, all hollowed. They stare at the ceiling in silence, too weak to cry. You survived, which means now, your training begins. Your name is taken. A new one is given. You are fed milk, sugar, almonds. Your skin is powdered, your eyebrows shaped, your walk softened. Your voice, if it ever returns, is high and breathy. Your job, they say, is to bring joy to the court. The court is a palace of mirrors, silk cushions, poetry etched on every wall, and behind its splendor, behind its divine claims and sacred texts, is the truth. No one speaks aloud. You were not brought here to guard. You were brought here to please. But before we continue, if you value long-form, quiet history that remembers the forgotten, consider subscribing and comment where you're watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like this. Now, back to the video. The Safavid Empire rose in the early 16th century, built on divine legitimacy and blood. Emerging from a militant Sufi order in Azerbaijan, the Safavid dynasty transformed a fragmented Persia into a theocratic empire that stretched from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Its rulers styled themselves as the shadow of God on earth. Their word was law, their desires sacred. The dynasty's founder, Shah Ismail, declared Twelver Shi'ism, the state religion in a region historically dominated by Sunni Islam. With that declaration came a brutal campaign of forced conversion, massacre, and institutional transformation. The Safavid court was not simply a political center. It became the embodiment of a divine order, and like all divine orders, it required sacrifices. At its peak, the Safavid court at Isfahan was a labyrinth of domed chambers, marble halls, and perfumed gardens. It was designed to reflect paradise, or at least the illusion of it. Poets called it the Garden of Light. Foreign dignitaries described it as otherworldly, even celestial. But what they failed to see or chose not to name was what made the illusion possible. The grandeur of the court depended not only on its artistry or its theology, it depended on bodies, on silence, on obedience. At the heart of this machine were the Gilman enslaved boys from Christian and animist backgrounds, mostly Georgian, Armenian, and Circassian. Some were captured through military raids in the Caucasus. Others were bought in slave markets through networks that spanned the Black Sea and Caspian trade routes. Most were children. These boys, once in imperial hands, were reclassified not as slaves, but as servants of the Shah. The distinction was bureaucratic, not moral. The term suggested loyalty and privilege, but it masked a system of complete ownership. The Safavid elite drew heavily from Islamic traditions, Persian court customs, and Byzantine legacy to craft a ritualized hierarchy in which these boys were forcibly integrated. They were stripped of their identities, their gods, and in many cases, their genitals. The rationale: a eunuch, once severed from manhood, could be trusted. He could not rape. He could not father children. He could not plot dynasties. He would not be tempted by women, or so they believed. In truth, eunuchs were more than neutralized threats. They were engineered tools, pliable, dependent, ornamental. Some were trained in arms and served as palace guards. Others were taught music, dance, or the art of conversation. But many were groomed to become intimate servants to the Shah and his household. They attended the bathhouse. They prepared garments. They sat close during meals. And sometimes they were asked for more. The Safavid court cloaked much of its internal life in mysticism and metaphor. Erotic poetry flourished, often draped in metaphysical language. A boy's beauty was likened to the divine. His presence was intoxicating. His skin, a mirror to God's own light. But beneath the verses lay a more carnal reality, one unspoken, yet widely known. Foreign envoys recorded what they saw. Jean Chardin, the French traveller who spent over a decade in Persia, noted that many of the Shah's closest attendants were beardless boys dressed in silks, their features painted, their movements rehearsed. He observed their intimate access to power, their centrality to ceremonies, and the strange silence surrounding their origin and condition. Islamic scholars debated the legality of castration but often avoided addressing its practical necessity in court life. Officially, castration was forbidden under Islamic law, but loopholes abounded. If a boy was castrated outside the empire's borders, then purchased, his condition was accepted. If a Christian merchant performed the act, it was considered permissible. The cruelty was outsourced. The utility was retained. By the 17th century, the presence of eunuchs in Safavid Persia had become normalized. They were fixtures of palace life, both visible and invisible. Their loyalty was prized, their suffering ignored, and all of it the abductions, the mutilations, the conversions was framed not as exploitation, but as divine order, because in the ideology of the Safavid state, to serve the Shah was to serve God, and to serve in silence, without resistance, was considered the highest honor, even if that service began with a scream no one acknowledged. His name was David, though no one in the palace ever called him that again. He was taken near Tbilisi, in the eastern hills of Georgia, during a seasonal raid when the mountains still held snow at their peaks. He was 11. His father had been killed in front of him, his older sister taken elsewhere. His mother was beaten when she tried to cling to him. That was the last time he saw any of them. The journey south blurred into a long punishment of sunburn and hunger. He lost his shoes in the 3rd week, and never asked for another pair. By the time they crossed into Persian territory, David no longer cried. Crying had become pointless. He had learned the rule that would define the rest of his life. Silence meant survival. When the caravan reached Shiraz, he and 3 other boys were sold at a private estate. No auction, no crowd, just a quiet transaction between 2 well-dressed men over sweet tea. David did not understand the words, but he saw the gesture, a nod, a wave, and then they were no longer children. They were inventory. In the weeks that followed, his body was softened. He was fed more than he had ever eaten before: goat milk, rice pudding, sugared almonds. He was bathed with rose water, his arms and legs scrubbed raw until his sunburn peeled away. When he resisted, he was struck. When he obeyed, he was stroked on the head like a favored pet. Then came the operation. There was no ceremony, no warning, just a forced bath, followed by a long room where no one spoke, and a man with sharp instruments who did not make eye contact. David remembered the heat of the cloth stuffed into his mouth, the way the 2 other boys held him down, the sudden pressure, the blinding pain, then the blackness. When he awoke, he was no longer a boy, nor was he yet a man. He was something else. The others taught him to move without making sound, to fold a robe without creasing the edge, to apply henna without dripping, to smile without showing teeth, to weep without making a sound. He was renamed Parviz, after a Persian prince known for his beauty and restraint. The name meant victorious, but David knew that no part of this was victory. The palace school trained him in recitation. He learned to speak Persian in the high dialect, careful and slow. He memorized verses from Hafez and Rumi, quoting lines about wine and divine love, never quite understanding why these poems always compared roses to lips and nightingales to boys. He learned to sing, not to project but to soothe. When he turned 13, he was transferred to the royal quarter at Isfahan. There, he was made to wear silk robes with long sleeves and red stitching. His waist was bound tightly with gold-threaded sashes. He learned to glide, not walk, to linger, not wait, and above all, to obey. At night, he slept in a room with 6 others, all eunuchs of varying ages. Some had served for years, and no longer spoke. Others still wept silently when the lights went out. They were not allowed to share memories. Their lives before the palace were considered impure, irrelevant. They had been reborn, they were told, and their loyalty was to the Shah, whose divine aura would protect them. But the Shah did not protect them from the hands that wandered in the dark, from the games that required them to undress, from the quiet summons to private chambers, where poetry gave way to touch. The older eunuchs taught the younger ones how to breathe without shaking, how to bite the inside of the cheek to keep from flinching, how to focus on the scent of the candles to forget the rest. And always, they reminded them, if you scream, you are punished. If you endure, you are rewarded. So Parviz endured. He learned how to fan the Queen Mother without ever lifting his eyes. He learned how to pour sherbet into crystal cups with a flourish. He learned how to light censers in the bathhouse, to anoint the royal skin with oils, to stand beside the Shah in silence, while foreign ambassadors marveled at the court's beauty. Sometimes, he was asked to sing while the Shah dined. Other times, he was summoned without reason. Each visit left a mark he could not name, a hollowing that no silk robe could cover. One of the French visitors, a Jesuit, tried to speak to him once. Asked where he was from, Parviz smiled and said, "From God." It was the answer they had taught him. It was the only answer that would not invite punishment. In moments of solitude, if such things existed in the palace, Parviz would sometimes whisper his old name, just to remember it, just to keep some part of himself from disappearing. David, he would say it in the dark. David, but in the morning, he would rise as Parviz. He would fold his robes. He would apply powder to his cheeks. He would rehearse lines of Sufi poetry that praised obedience as the path to enlightenment, and he would walk back into the mirror maze of the court, his real self locked deep beneath silk, beneath sugar, beneath silence. He was not alone. Hundreds of boys, across decades, shared this path, each one erased, repainted, renamed, each one a whisper in the marble halls of a palace that called itself divine. Each one a sacrifice no one remembered. It did not begin with cruelty. It began with paperwork. The Safavid court was an empire of ledgers, every robe measured, every concubine categorized, every eunuch registered. Within these records lay the machinery of silence, a bureaucracy so refined it made suffering appear sacred. The procurement of boys began at the northern borders. Georgian, Armenian, and Circassian children were marked as suitable due to their foreignness and non-Muslim origin. This made their castration permissible under Safavid interpretations of Islamic law. Technically, castration was forbidden, but in practice, a simple legal fiction sufficed so long as the act occurred outside Persian soil in Tbilisi, in Batumi, or aboard a merchant vessel. It was no crime. Once castrated, the boys were entered into the inventory of the royal court as gilman. The term once meant servant or youth, but over time it evolved into a euphemism for a specific class, sexually available, permanently obedient, and wholly owned. The records detailed their arrival age, condition, previous name, new name, and designation. Some were assigned to the music chamber, others to kitchen service, textile rooms, or bathhouses. A rare few, the most beautiful, the most docile, were designated intimates of the Shah, marked by a red ink symbol in the corner of their file. They were not listed as slaves. In the language of the court, they were referred to as companions or household kin. The words gave comfort to officials. They did not give freedom to the boys. A bureaucratic ritual sanitized the process. The Ministry of the Royal Household managed distribution. The treasurer allocated silk robes, gold-threaded sashes, and monthly sugar rations. The physician general recorded castration survival rates, noting with clinical detachment which boys bled to death, which succumbed to fever, and which survived intact. There were forms for every step of transformation. Before a boy could serve at court, he had to pass his adaptation period, lasting anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. During this time, He was stripped of language, memory, and resistance. Tutors instructed him in court etiquette. Elders, themselves eunuchs, demonstrated how to walk, how to kneel, how to apply powder to the face without blotching. Every gesture had a rule, every mistake had a consequence, and behind this rigid structure stood the ideology that made it all seem righteous. Safavid Persia clothed its cruelty in mysticism. It embraced the Sufi metaphor that the beloved must be both beautiful and unreachable. The Gilman fit this mold perfectly adored, adorned, and neutered. They were symbols of divine beauty without carnal danger, ornaments to reflect the Shah's perfection. Theologians wrote that serving the Shah brought the soul closer to God. Poets compared the Shah's glances to sunlight, his breath to spring wind. In such a court, submission was not oppression, it was exaltation. The boys were expected to embody this myth. They were instructed not only to serve but to radiate devotion. They kissed the floor when the Shah passed. They stood still as statues for hours. Their beauty was a form of obedience, their silence a prayer. Over time, the court developed a coded vocabulary to maintain illusion. A eunuch was never referred to as castrated. Instead, he was called purified. A night of service was not abuse. It was divine proximity. The boys were not enslaved. They were chosen. Diplomatic records reveal how foreign visitors navigated these fictions. Some, like the Venetian envoy Michel Membray, reported on the eunuchs with uneasy admiration, praising their grace, their knowledge of poetry, their seeming happiness. Others, like Jesuit priests, noted the sharp contrast between the court's outer piety and its inner practice. But none could penetrate the wall of smiles and rituals that surrounded the system, because the system was designed not merely to dominate, but to erase. By the time a eunuch reached adulthood, there was nothing left of the boy who arrived. His name was gone, his language forgotten, his family a memory he was forbidden to speak aloud, his body modified, his desire redirected or suppressed. He existed to serve, to decorate, to absorb the sins of others in silence. This was the genius of the system. It made its victims complicit. The older eunuchs, once broken, became trainers. They enforced the very rules that destroyed them. They taught the new boys to smile correctly, to endure without flinching, to anticipate the Shah's moods like weather. The pain of the past was buried beneath layers of ritual and sugar. Punishments were rare not because the court was gentle, but because disobedience had been bred out of them. A boy who wept was removed from service. A boy who resisted was transferred, a quiet word that meant exile, or worse. No one spoke of what happened beyond the walls. The economic cost of each eunuch was high. The court spent thousands of dinars on food, training, garments, but this cost was justified by their utility. Eunuchs were ideal, servants loyal, sterile, and pliant. They could be trusted in women's quarters, in treasury rooms, and in moments of the Shah's vulnerability, and so the court kept importing them, kept training them, kept turning childhood into performance. No scandal broke the cycle, no rebellion disturbed the illusion, because from the outside, it all looked beautiful. A palace of silk, a world of poetry, a garden tended by angels in red sashes, always smiling, always silent, no bloodstains, no screams, just forms filed in triplicate, under the seal of God's chosen ruler. Parviz did not remain a boy forever. By the time he reached 25, his limbs had thinned from their once rounded softness. His face, though still powdered each morning, had lost the youthful glow that once made courtiers glance twice. His voice was fragile, brittle from years of training it to stay high, but his silence that had deepened, perfected. He had become what they wanted, and now it was his turn to shape others. They called it guidance. He called it obedience. A new group of boys had arrived from the northern provinces, smaller than he remembered being, paler, more frightened. Their eyes scanned every surface, looking for answers no one gave. He stood before them in his crimson robes, sleeves brushing the marble floor. They knelt, as he had once knelt. He told them what they needed to hear, how to avoid punishment, how to bow correctly, how to survive. He repeated the same phrases once drilled into him. This is a house of light. Let your shadow disappear. He did not tell them about the nights, about the loneliness, about the way the soul shrinks when it is never allowed to speak. That knowledge, he had learned, was not useful. He trained them well, and in doing so, he perpetuated the very cycle that had broken him. This was the secret mechanism of the Safavid eunuch system. It did not merely mutilate bodies. It forged continuity. Each generation of eunuchs became the tools that shaped the next. There were no fathers in their world, no sons, but there was inheritance of behavior, of rituals, of silence. Boys who survived long enough became instructors, functionaries, administrators. Their trauma became policy. Their pain turned into instruction. At the peak of the Safavid court's power in the 17th century, the eunuch corps had become an institutional caste. They held keys to the treasury, managed palace logistics, mediated between the harem and the Shah. They even served as emissaries to foreign courts, where their presence, paradoxically, inspired both curiosity and respect. But respect was never autonomy. For all their titles, they remained tethered not just to the palace, but to the logic of their own undoing. Most never left the palace grounds. They aged there, quietly. Their graves were marked with names they had not been born with. Their stories did not survive in family memory, because they had no families. Some tried to adopt boys of their own, to train them, to form bonds, but these relationships were tightly regulated by the court. Emotional closeness was discouraged, affection viewed as disorder. The ideal eunuch was useful, beautiful, replaceable, and when he was no longer useful, he was dismissed, not with cruelty, with efficiency. A silk robe was folded and returned. A sleeping mat passed to another. His name was struck from the record. Another would kneel where he once had. Another would smile. Another would obey. The court did not see the system as cruel. It saw it as sacred continuity. Just as poetry was copied, just as tiles were glazed in repetition, so too was the role of the eunuch passed on. The ritual endured. The scars became tradition. Some eunuchs, broken but intelligent, rose high. They learned to manipulate court politics, to curry favor, to gain wealth. But wealth did not undo what had been done. It did not restore what had been taken. It only made the illusion more convincing. Parviz lived long enough to see his pupils become instructors themselves. He watched the cycle tighten, refine. Boys who had once flinched now instructed others to stand still. Hands that once trembled now lifted the blade. And always, the same phrases, the same songs, the same prayers. One day, in a corridor near the royal baths, he passed a boy, no older than 10. The child was new, his face was flushed, his walk unsure, but his smile that had already been trained. Parviz paused, looked at him. The boy did not meet his gaze. He simply bowed and walked on. It was then that Parviz realized the final truth of the system. The deepest cruelty was not in what was done once, but in what was taught to be done again. Pain that became policy, suffering that became sacred. There was no escape, not because the doors were locked, but because those inside had been taught to lock them themselves. The Safavid dynasty eventually declined, undone by external wars and internal decay. But the eunuch system, its logic, its rituals outlived the empire. It reappeared in later Persian courts. It persisted in whispers, in records, in the way poetry still spoke of rose-cheeked boys as divine. Parviz died in silence, his body buried near the garden walls, his name forgotten. But the cycle he helped preserve endured. Long after his grave was dust, the boys still arrived, still smiled, still obeyed. There are no monuments to them, no tombs of marble, no epics sung in their honor, no family lines to pass their names down. Their presence, so central to the splendor of Safavid court life, left almost no trace in the world that followed. But the silence they were trained to carry never fully disappeared. It lingers. In the court poetry that survives, you can still find them, boys with skin like moonlight, voice like flute, limbs soft as silk. They are written not as people, but as metaphors, divine longing, holy beauty. Their suffering is transfigured into aesthetics. A rose petal, torn open, a wine cup, always refilled, a nightingale, singing in a gilded cage. These metaphors are beautiful, And they are lies. The reality was flesh, torn and reshaped, blood on cold stone, screams swallowed under oath, and a life spent smiling while forgetting who you were. Century later, Persian historians would study the Safavid period as a golden age. Architecture flourished, philosophy bloomed, trade routes expanded. The city of Isfahan itself became a model of imperial beauty, half the world, as they called it, but rarely do those chronicles mention what that world was built upon. The eunuch boys of Persia were not side characters. They were infrastructure. Their bodies were the invisible scaffolding that supported the entire edifice of royal image. They ensured the Shah's purity, protected his secrets, adorned his ceremonies, and absorbed his sins. And when they were no longer needed, they vanished. Some of their names survive only in foreign travelogues, filtered through mistranslation and condescension. A few appear in palace records, short lines marking their role in a procession or their death from fever, but most were reduced to inkless roles: the cupbearer, the bath attendant, the boy in red silk who held the fan. Even those who rose to power left behind little that could be traced to a self. Their memoirs were not written, their voices not recorded, their lineage, by design, extinguished. And yet, they shaped everything. The normalization of their suffering helped create a court culture where obedience was beautified, where hierarchy became divine order, where pain could be turned into poetry, and then forgotten. This normalization did not end with the Safavids. Subsequent dynasties inherited the structure. Later, Qajar courts maintained eunuch attendance, though the practice of castration shifted to other territories. The same legal evasions were employed, the same rationales, the same silences. Elsewhere, echoes of this system reappeared in different robes. In the Ottoman Empire, in Mughal India, in Ming China, the eunuch re-emerged, again and again, not as anomaly, but as function, a body altered to suit empire. In each case, the empire claimed necessity, the court claimed purity, the poets claimed beauty, but no one asked the boys, no one listened for what was lost. Today, if you walk the halls of the Chehel Sultan Palace in Isfahan, you will see walls painted with triumphant battle scenes and diplomatic banquets. You will see mirrored ceilings and manicured gardens, symbols of Persian grandeur, but you will not see the boys who swept those floors before the guests arrived. You will not hear the footsteps of the eunuch who lit the incense, or placed the cushion just so. Their hands shaped the space, but the space forgot them. There is no museum for them, no schoolbook chapter, and yet their story is not truly gone. It lives in the logic we inherit, the way we still separate bodies by use, the way we still justify cruelty if it serves beauty, the way we still silence those who serve in shadows. The eunuch boys of Persia were not accidents of history. They were designed, purchased, broken, and made indispensable. Theirs is not a story of exception. It is a system's natural conclusion when power seeks loyalty without risk, beauty without threat, service without resistance. A body that can neither speak nor escape. A boy who cannot become a man. A history written by those who turned him into an object, then wept over his loveliness. This is their legacy, not in marble, but in the way silence can become sacred.